Alpine Formula 1 are the most frustrating team on the grid. They have the finances and the history to be the team that displaces the current big three and consistently win races. And yet, Alpine look closer to being a backmarker team than championship contenders. Their off-track antics and on-track troubles led them to finishing a lonely 6th place last year. But why are they so underwhelming? Let's delve into the Alpine Formula 1 team, why they lose staff so often, how they've mastered merchandising, and if we'll see their drivers back on top anytime soon. Since Alpine have been on the Formula 1 grid, they've constantly been a solid midfield team, capable of challenging for podiums every now and then. But they've never really been able to bridge the gap to the top teams in Formula 1. And I think because the Alpine name is attached to the team rather than Renault, it's sometimes lost that they are a works team that produce everything for themselves, which is also the case for only 3 other teams at the moment: Mercedes, Ferrari, and once Red Bull powertrains get sorted out fully, Red Bull. And when you start to group Alpine with those other 3 teams, the 3 most successful Formula 1 teams in the last 2 decades, you start to realize that Alpine should be achieving so much more. Because yes, we can group Alpine with those 3 in terms of the fact that they are an engine manufacturer, but if you start to talk about Alpine compared to those 3 on track, it's not even a conversation worth having. But that hasn't always been the case for Renault. Renault has gone through eras where it's helped be a core factor in race wins and championship victories. The first ones that jump to mind for myself were obviously the wins and championships that we saw at the hands of Fernando Alonso, a full works Renault team winning back-to-back drivers and constructors championships. But not only that, they went on to be the engine manufacturer that guided Red Bull to its first championships with Sebastian Vettel, the German winning 4 championships in a row between 2010 and 2013 with a Renault engine behind him. So they have pedigree, they've shown they can produce race-winning cars and race-winning engines. So what's keeping Alpine so far off the pace in the last few seasons? Well, personally, I feel like the main issue throughout this Renault-Alpine era is that the team constantly generates more attention off track than on it. Every news story that you read around Alpine is never actually to do with the racing. Instead, the news circulating around Alpine is about behind the scenes changes where key figures in managerial roles or their actual drivers have no faith in the team moving forwards because they've just been treated so badly, and therefore they're jumping ship and breaking contracts to escape. Or it's news of brand endorsements and celebrity investments, like the fact that Alpine Racing gave away a 24% share in their team earlier on last year to an investment group that includes actors like Ryan Reynolds, Rob McElhenney, and Michael B. Jordan. So I figured what we should really do is look at these 2 types of news stories separately. First, the loss of key team members and why it just keeps happening, because it does feel like every couple of years we have a brand new set of team members to get to know at Alpine. And once again, Alpine experienced a serious managerial upheaval due to a mismatch between corporate expectations and on-track performance in 2023. The Renault higher-ups believe the team should be competing for victories and challenging near the top end of the grid. But the team that are trackside are much more realistic in their expectations and are aware of how much of a gap there is between them and the top teams. I mean, the team has faced real challenges in making performance improvements due to a lack of investment in their Enstone factory in recent years, and that has nothing to do with the trackside engineers. But they're given no help by the higher-ups, and instead the pressure they are put under to perform just pushes them to breaking point, meaning that Alpine end the year without the original CEO, team principal, or sporting director that they started 2023 with. Possibly the 3 most important people in a Formula 1 team, because they're the people guiding the team, and now they all have to be replaced. And it's not like these 3 are just nobodies that you can replace easily. The CEO, Laurent Rossi, began his career at Renault in 2000 in the powertrains department, and although he wasn't there the entire time, he was well respected on the Formula 1 grid. Otmar Zafnauer has been working in Formula 1 since 1989 with teams like BAR and Honda and Force India, which is the team that also became Aston Martin, and he was a key player specifically at Force India when he guided the team to their best finish of 4th place in 2016, whilst Pat Fry, who was overseeing the technical side, would leave Alpine to join Williams Racing as their chief technical officer. And you wouldn't be picked up by another team instantly if you weren't seen as quite good at your job. And let's not forget, it's not just the off-track staff that haven't been treated overly well by the Alpine higher-ups. The 2023 summer break exodus of team members comes exactly 1 year after the Alpine team also lost out on a possible driver lineup of Fernando Alonso, who went on to be one of the top 3 drivers over the course of the 2023 season in most people's eyes, and Oscar Piastri, who at their rivals McLaren put in one of the best rookie seasons that we've seen in a very long time, and is building a reputation as one of the most highly sought after young talents in Formula 1 right now. Meaning over the course of 12 months, they've lost, I would argue, the 5 most influential people both on and off track within that whole Formula 1 team. 3 key personnel off track that were guiding the team forwards, their most experienced driver, and let's not forget former world champion, and a young driver that they invested heavily into, brought all the way through the ranks into Formula 1, only to see him fly with another team. Then, as I mentioned before, the second type of news that we ever seem to hear around Alpine is about endorsements and investments from other brands and sports people and celebrities. And I think this is something that they've actually seemed to nail. Like, I definitely feel like they're the most forward-thinking of teams in terms of this. Like, their collaboration that happened at the Vegas Grand Prix between them and Kappa Palace was everywhere, whilst they've also been making huge strides in the esports space over the last few years with the GP Explorer events, which are quite easy to miss if you're not part of the French Formula 1 YouTube space. But Alpine helped with the Formula 4 event, which had some of the biggest YouTubers and streamers in France taking part, and it had over 60,000 people attend live with 1.3 million concurrent viewers online, making it, I think, the biggest French live stream on Twitch in history. So it does feel like they've got the right idea, working with brands and people that will definitely gain them recognition and attention. It's just a shame that all of that attention is going into a team that's not really achieving much. And then on top of that, as I said, Renault selling a 24% share in Alpine Racing, plus the fact that they're doing so well with these collaborations off track, does make you wonder if they're putting more effort into that rather than the racing side of things. It just gives across the idea that they're using the sport as a bit of a marketing exercise. And Renault have often felt like they're using Formula 1 as a big marketing tool, and that they're not really bothered about challenging the big teams, especially with the Alpine branding. It's kind of a reflection of that, in my opinion. Rather than race under the Renault name, a prestigious name in Formula 1 with multiple championships, they'd rather race under the name of a niche French sports car that nobody really knows about. The amount of people I talked to when it was first announced that were pronouncing it Alpine rather than Alpine was crazy. So it begs the question as to, with all this marketing and fundraising, is the money that they make actually going back into making the car quicker? In terms of the car that they've got right now, is really not going very well, especially when it comes to their power unit. They're the only team that currently uses Renault engines, and you can understand why nobody else wants them. Their performance is nowhere close to the other options in Mercedes, Ferrari, and Red Bull. The Alpine team calculated a deficit in the region of 30 horsepower from their turbo hybrid engine compared to the rival manufacturers. And in fact, I've seen some reports that on tracks where top speed and power of the engine is crucial, the deficit in their power unit's performance cost the team around 0.3 seconds per lap. It even got to the point where they felt like they were so far off with their power unit that Renault even requested permission from the FIA to take a holiday from the power unit freeze that we currently have in Formula 1 so that they could actually develop their current engine and change it before the 2026 regulation changes come into play. However, this holiday wasn't granted, so Alpine find themselves with a massive power unit deficiency. The team says that efforts to get the most out of their power unit have continued, and they're able to minimize and manage the gap on most tracks, but the power unit deficit is expected to still be there and will continue to impact Alpine's performance on track for the next 2 seasons of these regulations. So all the team can do now is start working on their next power unit as soon as possible and set the goal of at least matching everybody else by the time they can put the brand new power unit into the car in 2026. Although putting those power unit performance issues aside, it does also feel like the Alpine team faced real challenges in finding performance improvements for their car in the second year of the current regulation cycle. if we compare Alpine's ability to make significant improvements to the likes of Aston Martin, who started the 2023 season on fire and picked up podium after podium, or the likes of McLaren that 10 races into the season came with an upgrade which completely changed their fortunes and made them the team closest to Red Bull on more than a few occasions, and then you contradict that with Alpine, who did bring upgrades, their car changed throughout the season, and Alpine put a real emphasis on making the car run closer to the ground, and this was their main goal because it was identified by technical director Matt Harmon that the Alpine chassis also has its limitations. The team was running into ride issues which prevented it from running the car as low as the aero map had designed it to be, leading to huge problems with aerodynamic efficiency, particularly in low speed corners where they really struggled with stability on corner exits. So they needed to run the car lower to the ground so that they could get better rotation through the corners without developing rear instability, which was costing them a huge amount of lap time in the corners, on top of the fact that they were losing out on the straights because of their engine. So they weren't very good at slow speed corners and they weren't very good at high speed straights. You can start to see why they were having issues. However, even when they achieved their goals, the gains that they saw were not substantial, and at no race this season did it look like they were anywhere near third or fourth fastest on the grid, let alone getting anywhere near a Red Bull. Which meant that heading into the final races of the season, Alpine were the only team that had really nothing significant to fight for. Okay, their two drivers were still battling for the possibility of coming 10th in the drivers' standings, and obviously they were still battling between themselves to be the higher placed Alpine driver, but the team themselves didn't really have anything. They finished 6th in the Constructors' Championship, which is a respectable season considering Williams, who ended up in 7th, were nowhere near them, but there was a substantial gap between them and Aston Martin and McLaren in front, who had both had quite up and down seasons, which left them in this kind of no man's land with nothing to fight for. So I looked into it and I was like, maybe they came 6th place by such a big margin because they got a little bit unlucky with reliability in some races and they lost out on more points than they should have, but realistically, 6th place in the Constructors' Championship was a perfect reflection of the A523 car's capabilities. The car was the 6th fastest car, approximately 0.9 seconds slower in terms of qualifying pace than this year's Red Bull. And don't get me wrong, like every team, they had weekends where they looked a little bit better, and some weekends where they looked a little bit worse. But genuinely, pretty much every single weekend, they were just the 6th fastest car, and therefore only picked up points when something went wrong for one of the teams in front of them. So should they just give up? Well, if I had to pick one positive of the Alpine project, it's that even though they have had constant rotation of drivers and 4 team principals in 4 years, suggesting that drivers may feel quite insecure about their long-term position in the team, they have still been able to bring in some incredible names. And they always seem to have a pretty decent driver lineup. You look at the fact that they convinced Daniel Ricciardo to come for a couple of seasons, and they convinced Fernando Alonso to step back onto the Formula 1 grid with Alpine. And even now, I would say that after losing Alonso and Piastri, they still have a good, solid driver lineup. They have enough pull and money to invest in making sure that they have talented and competitive drivers. And in recent years, they've never gone through a cycle of having an underwhelming back-of-the-field driver just to fill a spot. And I did a live stream recently where I talked about the fact that I think Alpine probably have the 5th best driver pairing on the grid. Pierre Gasly and Esteban Ocon are pretty evenly matched as a combination, and as much as they don't really get along with each other, the both of them are incredibly dependable drivers, especially for a midfield team. And let's not forget that both of them achieved podiums in Monaco and the Netherlands this year. And don't get me wrong, I don't think either of them are championship winning drivers. They both lack a little bit of that cutting edge, and I don't think in the future we'll ever say that either of these drivers was elite, but both are quick and both have the ability to get the maximum out of that Alpine car on a good weekend, which, considering they don't seem like they're going to win races anytime soon, is a very good driver lineup for where they are on their current path on the Formula 1 grid. And it should be said, another positive alongside that, despite the challenges, the team is finally updating the Enstone factory's infrastructure. Former CEO Laurent Rossi, after the 24% purchase from the Redbird Capital Group, told the team the incremental revenue generated will be in turn reinvested into the team in order to further accelerate our mountain climber plan, aimed at catching outperforming the top teams in terms of state-of-the-art facilities and equipment. The fruits of which will be seen next season, with a more modern simulator being the latest addition into their factory for 2024. But long term, the upgrades to the facilities have a focus on managing their power unit gap while preparing the E26 and aiming for a competitive performance boost in 2026 when those engine regulations change. So whilst on paper, Alpine have the potential to be competitive as a fourth full works team in Formula 1, and there's no reason why, if things were done properly, they couldn't have made similar progress to McLaren and Aston Martin last season. Even with their power unit problems, the disruption within the team due to sudden changes by Renault's corporate bosses forcing key personnel out the door makes it really difficult to predict Alpine's trajectory. Whilst they're doing an incredible job off track building the Alpine brand and being part of amazing collaborations and events, we're still yet to see how much of an impact that will really have on track and whether Renault and Alpine are serious about being a race-winning team once again. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like we're going to have those answers until the 2026 season rolls around. But I'd love to know what you think. Alpine is clearly currently less than the sum of its parts, and changes are definitely needed for the future. But what changes would you make if you were in charge of Alpine? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you've enjoyed this video, I also made this video here on whether or not Nick de Vries was actually as bad as we remember him being. So click that link and I'll see you over there.